This tape is a continuation of the previous message.
See all the industry involved? This would be a major thing. And it certainly was still true in the first century, as Acts 27 shows. All right, now we're getting all the pieces of the ship put together, of different type of wood, from different locales, of course. Blue and purple from the Isles of Elisha was that which covered thee. The inhabitants of Zidon and Arvad were thy mariners, thy wise men, O Tyre, that were in thee were thy pilots. And the ancients of Gebal, the wise men thereof, were in thee thy caulkers. All the ships of the sea with their mariners were in thy so forth. They of Persian, of Lud, and of Put were in thine army, thy men of war. Let's skip down to 12. Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with silver, iron, tin, lead, they traded in thy fairs. Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, they were thy merchants. They traded the persons of men. Oh, slave trade there. And vessels of brass in thy market. Probably more literally bronze. They of the house of Togarmah traded in thy fairs with horses and horsemen and mules. The men of Dedan were thy merchants. Many isles were the merchandise of thine hand. They brought thee for a present horns of ivory and ebony. Aram was thy merchant by reason. See, it's going country by country, and the Mediterranean trade and the products involved here. It's a tremendous, tremendous study. Ezekiel 27 is one of those, well, it doesn't have a lot to say theologically here, but it's one of those great chapters of the Old Testament for historical considerations and for archaeology and things of this nature. They occupied in thy fairs with emeralds, purple, broidered work, fine linen, coral. And look, we're going to get to Jews now. Judah, what did they trade in? What did they have an excess of? You trade what you have an excess of. Judah and the land of Israel, they were thy merchants. They traded in thy market wheat and honey and oil and balm. You see, Judah and Israel were trading. Damascus was thy merchant, the multitude of the wares of thy making, for the multitude of all riches, in the wine and white wool. Dan also and Javan going to and fro occupied in thy fairs. Bright iron, cassia, calamus were in thy market. Dedan was thy merchant in precious clothes for chariots. Arabia and all the princes of Kedar, they occupied for thee in lambs, rams, goats. The merchants of Sheba and Ramah, they were thy merchants. They occupied in thy fairs with the chief of all spices, with all precious stones and gold. Haran, Canaan, Edom, the merchants of Sheba, Ashur, were thy merchants, and all sorts of things, and blue clothes, broidered work, and chests of rich apparel, bound with cords, made of cedar, among thy merchandise. The ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market. Thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. It's a tremendous a seagoing account here of the ancient people of Tyre. They were the leading trading, merchandising city and people of the ancient world of this time, located in, as he said, situate on the entry of the sea in verse 3 of this chapter, located in a very, very prime position and traded with nations all over the world. Most of that by sea, maybe not all of it totally by sea, but most of that was certainly trading by sea, shipping on the Mediterranean. Okay, another thing we'll mention that could be included in this, or one aspect of it could be outside of that as far as industry is concerned, is the importing of luxury goods. The importing of luxury goods by way of caravans. We'll come back to the sea thing here in a moment. We've already seen some of that right here. Shipping on the Mediterranean. But then why did they ship? Well, so they could import goods, import and export. But we're separating the two things because just the shipping on the Mediterranean was something in itself. Someone had to go to the trouble of building all of the ships and manning them then. The importing of luxury goods by way of caravans from the south and from the east of Palestine. This continued right up into New Testament days. This was no new discovery of Marco Polo. Marco Polo's work was just a rediscovery of what Israel had been practicing for centuries and centuries. You're familiar with Marco Polo? Not swimming now. We're talking about the real man, not the game you play when you get in the water, Marco Polo, but the real man. He was a real man. But he didn't discover the Orient. He rediscovered the Orient for Europe. Been discovered centuries and millennia prior to that. The importing of luxury goods by way of caravans from the south and from the east. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 10. Solomon would be our best case here, and the Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings chapter 10. All this applies to the New Testament. Nothing changes then. You know, every country is known for the goods that it produces. There are just some countries that just don't have what others have. Like we don't mine platinum in this country. I think we mined 1,000 ounces last year of platinum. The Soviet Union mined 500,000 ounces of platinum. We just don't have it in this country. So you have to get it from some other source then. Israel just doesn't have some things. She didn't have them in the old, and then they aren't all of a sudden recreated or created in the dust of Palestine in the New Testament. She still doesn't have them. She just doesn't have them. And if you're going to get them, you're going to have to get them from another source then. And so here is part of the industry then, and it would be a very important link in the chain. That would be the importation of especially luxury items. 1 Kings 10, 21 through 23. And all of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. Now Israel just really didn't have any gold, none really to speak of. And all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. For the king had at sea. So see, we're going back to shipping, but we're talking about the importation of luxury goods here. He had at sea a navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish bringing gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. And then if you just jump back into the earlier portion of this chapter, like verse 10, she gave the king, Queen of Sheba, 120 talents of gold, and of spices very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to the king of Solomon. That is, none besides what she gave. And then it goes back into the navy. The navy of Hiram brought gold from Ophir, almug trees, and precious stones. So there you get the caravan in verse 10, and you get the shipping in verses 11 and 12 and 21 through 23. It's still the importing of luxury goods. Why would Israel need to import all this gold and silver, you see, if she already had gold and silver there in her own land? And she basically didn't and basically doesn't today. If you didn't back then, you still don't have it today. Of course, you may not have discovered it back then and just discovered it recently. That sometimes happens, but its existence, though, doesn't change. And so she has to import that. And one thing, notice that we're coming across many times is spices. Spices are being imported. They got that, a lot of that from the Orient, from the south and from the east, come the famous spices of the Orient. Okay, and then another area of industry. We've looked at shipping, importing luxury goods. Another important industry, if we're going to call it industry, it's somewhat industry, is mining. Mining. The mining of iron, and especially the mining of copper. The mining of iron and copper. Let's see, Deuteronomy chapter 8. And there's a verse over here in, before you go back out of Kings. You might want to hold your hand there in 1 Kings 7. 1 Kings 7, we'll jump back over to that here in just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Let's see. Verse 9. Well, here's some of the things that Israel does have. Verse 7, the Lord thy God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills. And Israel certainly has a lot of that. A land of wheat and barley. We come across that all the time. Vines, fig trees, pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey. We've come across that already. A land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. That means plenty of wheat and barley, from which you make your flour, from which you make your bread. You'll not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron. Well, he doesn't literally mean iron stones, but he's talking about mining here, the mining of iron. And out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. Now, most of the times in the King James Version, brass really should be bronze. They're really two different metals, and most of the time it should be bronze. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and they didn't have zinc. Whereas bronze comes from copper and tin. The copper is the same for both brass and bronze. But they did have tin. Israel didn't have zinc, so that only leads us to the conclusion that most of the time the word should be bronze, because bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and brass comes from copper and zinc. Although some of the times the word just may refer to copper, since copper was the most important thing that was mined. In other words, you know what an alloy or an alloy is. You've got a metal that's a combination of two other metals. There's no such thing as brass. I mean, you just don't go and dig brass. You can't just go and dig bronze. There's no such thing as that. That is a product. That is a man-made product that you make out of copper and zinc, or that you make out of copper and tin. So you can't go dig brass. That was the King James translators really didn't know. They didn't know much about metallurgy. They didn't know much about that. So they don't know a lot about mining. But the point of the matter is you can't dig brass or bronze. No such thing exists. You could dig to the center of the earth. You'd never find an ounce of brass or bronze. You'd find some copper and some zinc and some tin. And if you get to working and smelting, you could end up with some brass and some bronze. All right, then if you jump over to 1 Kings 7. So that's the promise of God that mining would be an important work in Palestine. And here we're to the days of Solomon, and there are mines still in existence, some still used today that date to the time of Solomon in the Old Testament. Of course, they're copper mines is what they are. Some of them are tin mines, but most of them in Israel today are copper mines. Israel does have a lot of copper, as well as iron. He promised iron there as well. Let's see. Verse 45. Verse 45, the pots, the shovels, the basins, and all these vessels which Hiram made to King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of bright brass. Well, there we're back to brass. It really should be something like burnished bronze. In the plain of Jordan did the king cast them, in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarthan. And that has been substantiated and proven archaeologically as well. He cast them. You know, you have to make a mold, and you'd make the mold here in the clays and bake it, and you'd end up with your cast or your mold to form your pots, your shovels, your basins in verse 45. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed because they were exceeding many. Neither was the weight of the bronze found out. Bronze, it comes from copper and tin. Israel had tin and not zinc. So there are three of what I can think of, three of the biggest areas in, let's just say, the New Testament, where industry would enter the picture. Shipping on the Mediterranean, the importation of luxury goods such as certain animals, certain metals, gold and silver, or particularly spices. And that's what Marco Polo was famous for, importing spices, bringing those back to Europe, as well as some of the jewels and things that were found in the Orient, in China and India as well. Now, remember, I have said before that the middle class was practically non-existent in the ancient world. There was an upper class, there was a lower class. Acts 19 forms a rare exception to the rule of there being no middle class. And here we would almost have another form of industry. And these are the craftsmen of Acts 19 at the city of Ephesus. They formed a rare exception to the rule of there being no middle class. Verse 24, a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Artemis, brought no small gain unto the craftsman. Okay, these men who are actually making them, where do they get the silver? They don't mine the silver. They're not out doing that. You got to have three parties involved to have a middleman. So someone else does the mining of it. They purchase it. They form it, work it into these little shrines. That makes them the middleman. And then they sell that, the price of the silver jacked up, including their labor costs. Then they would sell that to other people. And they form a rare exception to what we would call the middle class. So I thought I might mention that, lest you think that I wasn't aware of this case over here. There are a couple of others in Scripture, but we won't really get into that. Okay, that deals enough with industry then. Before we go on, we are going a little longer than I meant to. Maybe I need to just finish this out, though. I thought we'd get certainly through all of this. We need to get down to the bottom of page 3 so we can say we've done something tonight in the intertestamental period. Let's go to the subject of the common man as far as occupations are concerned. Ruling out what we've just mentioned as far as industry goes, why don't you give me, I've got a long, long list, why don't you give me a list. We're talking about economically, so we're talking about jobs, occupations, we're talking about money. Why don't you give me a list of the ways in which you can make your living in those days? We'll see how many we can get up here. Oh, I heard a fireman is what I heard, because everything was put together. Something real loud, something good.
Carpenter.
A carpenter. Well, let's just write, and maybe if they're worth commenting on, I'll comment on them. A carpenter. Okay, what type of carpenter? Building what? Furniture. Furniture? All right. Is that what Jesus was? How do we know that? It says that he was a carpenter. But what did he build, though? We don't know, huh? Carpenter. All right, we'll leave that up there. There's such thing. You can make a living building furniture. Carpenter. What's another one? Farmer. All right. We'll come back to these. That's a big one. We'll come back to that. Let's skip over that since we've discussed that with goods and... That's another big one. We'll come back to that one. A mason. All right. What would you do? Work with bricks and sell them? Build. What would you build with them? Temples. All right, you're going to have someone that works over all the slaves that build these things. Those guys don't know what they're doing. You just say, heave, and they start heaving then. But you've got to build whatever it is they're going to heave then. You've got to have the mathematical abilities to get all of that done. All right, got to have a mason then. You'd be surprised how many occupations there were. But you'd be surprised that there are not that many people involved in these things, though. Tent maker. Okay. Teacher? What type of teacher? Religious? So we'd have to have two different types of teachers then. I mean, like, see, that would get into the scribes. Did the scribes make any? How'd they make their money? I mean, you just couldn't run around being a Pharisee. Well, I'm a Pharisee. You gotta earn a living, though. You can't just say I'm a Pharisee and that guarantees a living. You got to earn a living somehow. All right, let's get a religious one and we'll get a secular one. And that brings in the whole subject of schooling then in the first century. Was there such thing as a school where you sent your children and someone taught them and someone had to pay them to teach them? Maybe they taught for free in those days. Okay, another thing. A what? A tanner. All right, that's a recent one. And that's one that probably a lot of people wouldn't think of. So we just discussed that recently. That's wearing out on me. Someone buy me another blue one. A tanner. What else? Physician. A physician. A shoemaker. Sandal maker. Someone's going to make sandals. All right. Someone's going to make their shoes then. Tax collector. We've discussed taxes. We'll skip over that. But yeah, a tax collector. a butcher, a baker.
A candlestick maker.
They have candlesticks here. Butcher, baker. Now baker, pardon? Well, let's just, pardon? Millers? This is interesting. You'll be really interested in another class whenever we get to the other one that deals with all of this. Baking. Let's jump back to, where is that? Jeremiah 37, the last verse. I almost mentioned this as industry, and I decided not to. I didn't know if anybody would guess it or not. Jeremiah 37:21. Yes, women did it, but what about, how did bachelors ever get their bread then? From their mothers. Or their mother was dead, though. Zedekiah the king commanded that they should commit Jeremiah into the court of the prison, that they should give him a daily piece of bread out of the baker's street, until all the bread in the city was spent, or were spent. Evidently, we're not told a lot about this, but evidently there was a street where there were a lot of bakers there, and they did public business there. Public business. Baking bread, baking all different types of things. Lots of people involved in lots of different professions back then. What else? We just scratching the surface. You wouldn't believe the list that I've got. Okay, so like a peddler or something. Well, he'd be a peddler peddling food, but what about peddling all different types of things, though? If you're a traveling peddler, you know, we think of that back in colonial America with your little wagon, and you've got all types of pots and pans and the latest thing from Montgomery Ward there. As far as selling food, well, sure, you'd raise your vegetables out in your garden, you'd bring them in to the city and set up a little table there and try to make some money doing that. Okay. Weavers.
Blacksmith.
A what? A blacksmith? I'm just thinking how this relates to everything. I'm not criticizing anything. Anything that you say that fits, just fits. A fuller? What's a fuller do? Whitens clothes. A fuller? What's a tanner do? You mentioned tanner. What? And all right, to make clothing out of, or to cover the door of your teepee with.
Soldier.
All right, what else?
Soldier.
Soldiers. A what?
Entertainers.
Entertainers. Well, that's an interesting field. Like what? Are we in Greece or are we in Israel right now? All right. We'd really have to move up into Greece for that. One thing Israel is not known for was their poets or entertainers. That was a way. Let's try to confine ourselves to Israel. It's interesting when you make yourself think like this. In the sycamore tree? Oh, okay. What are we going to call him? A field hand, then? You talking about Amos? Field hand? An innkeeper? Someone to work the bar and change the linens in the inn. Again, it broadens your view of the ancient world. Winemakers. Let me just hasten to add, lest you think, well, I see a lot of industries back then. This was just so minuscule. You made your own wine. You baked your own bread. You made your own clothes. You built your own house. You were your mason, your carpenter. You were your entertainer. You were your physician. You tanned things. You were your fuller. So remember that. There was very little of this involved in a large, broad fashion. You did all of that on your own. But all of these things were possibilities, though. But I mean, not 1 in 10 would be involved in these things, though. I'll show you what they were involved in here in a moment. Pardon? No, that really is, the upper class, all they do is just count their interest on their money that they have stored away. That's how they make their money. This is all basically lower class people here involved in this. Yes. Bankers? Certainly. That's Matthew. Matthew's got a reference to bankers. They had banks then. Lenders. Yeah, personnel manager and everyone else, a teller at the bank, everyone else that fits with the bankers. Hunters. See, all of this was involved. You have people who are professional hunters, but most of the time you whack that old deer yourself in your backyard is how you got him. What? We're probably going a little too far with all of this. Okay, someone had that like a peddler, someone who sold things. We're forgetting a lot of the big things here. A nurse for children. We're stretching it really far to put all these things up there. Because the nurse, the dry nurse, was the big sister in the family, or the grandmother. I'd strike out a lot of things that we have up here if I was listing occupations. They really wouldn't fit as an occupation. Where someone actually made a living, you know. Someone like Naomi, if she's not making a living for Ruth. She just is the grandmother dry nurse is what she is. Okay, that's something very specific. Acts 16. We've got several things in Acts 16. The people making the money with the girl who prophesies things by the false spirit, and we've got Lydia, the seller of purple. Yeah.
Weapons manufacturers.
Sure, someone's got to make weapons.
Do they have like a news carrier or mail?
Oh, sure. They had postal workers. Saw that back in Nehemiah's book. Someone's got to ride the king's steed or stallion to deliver the mail. Someone has to do that. Jailers. What? Messengers. We'll leave them under postal people there. What else did they do or have to have back then? Okay, we'll leave all that with what we've discussed in Ezekiel 27 there. You have to have someone build all those ships and cut down the wood and sew the cloth for the what do you call them? Sails, for the sails on the ship. You've got to have someone do all of that. How do you see people working? I mean, just, take the average person. What is he going to be doing? He can't be king or something like that. Just the average person. What's he going to be doing? Making roads. All right, all that goes back to slavery. Slaves would be doing that. Would you say?
You said they'd be farming.
Farming. All right. Yeah, we've got that up here. A gatekeeper. Yeah, like at a city or something. Yeah, gatekeepers. Lawyers. Titus 3, lawyers. That is such a small list now. I thought you would even be able to think of more and of better than that. Very small list. But of course you could sit and think all day and maybe you could end up with some more things there. Like I said, I'd strike a lot of those things out. So if I started striking out what I would strike out as being anywhere near being a typical occupation of anyone, a lot of those things would actually go out, I mean, you can't, like the butcher and the baker, Well, we've already looked at Baker as far as Jeremiah chapter 37 is concerned. But you can't get into the realm of, let's say, someone working for the king. You could have Nehemiah cupbearer, but how many people were cupbearers in the ancient world, Or someone who prepared all of Solomon's food for him. That would be some people, a select people that were maybe relatives of friends of his that actually gained entrance into the king's court. But take a Mary and a Joseph, or a Peter, a James, a John, someone like that. They're not going to be involved in so many of these things. Or their wives or whatever are not going to be involved in so many things. You'd strike out a whole list of these things up here and start reducing it smaller and smaller and smaller just to a few areas. A lot of the things could be reduced to things that we've mentioned that I might not have put up here, to slavery. Slaves would be involved in doing that. Therefore, we don't really count it as an occupation, such as the building of roads in the Roman Empire. Well, they would just compel slaves to do that. They were building the roads all over the empire. Now, they had to have some Roman engineers to go with them. It takes more than just back muscles to build a road. You got to make it so the rain doesn't wash it out, and it's got to last for a little while, like for a couple of thousand years. That took a Roman engineer to plan all of that and to figure all of that out. But again, we're talking basically still about Palestine, the Jews.
For the continuation
But again, we're talking basically still about Palestine, the Jews. And obviously they would have a few engineers. They would have to have a few engineers, but that's not a normal occupation for anyone. Maybe you're getting the point here. People were not involved in these things. That's the whole point in this. People were not involved in anything related to industry or something like that. There would be very, very, very few people in something as this. Sure, we have things, fullers, tanners, sellers of purple mentioned in the New Testament. But how many of those do we have mentioned there versus things like this? A farmer, a fisherman, shepherd. And even striking shepherd out, a farmer and a fisherman would definitely be the two biggest things, because it was an agrarian society. It was all based on agriculture. So let's just briefly get into this for a few moments then. You did, I don't know, that's probably a C- or a D+. I would give you on that little quiz. You'll probably go home thinking about it more now, though. Think about, well, what did they do back then? Again, keep it to the average person. Keep it to the average person. What did he do? He was born right there on the couch on the living room floor, and he was raised right there, and he tended things around the house, and then whenever he got big enough, then he took over the back 25 acres of his father's property, and he had a wife, and his son was born on the couch on their living room floor. And then whenever his son got big enough, hopefully his 25 acres has expanded now, so he can give all of his sons some of his territory then. Yes, they were, although most of the people in the land of Palestine were free men, they were not slaves. They generally made their living off the land. That's the most basic way we could describe it. They generally made their living off the land. I just think all of this is interesting because these did exist. And by that, of course, we mean either by fishing or by farming. And with farming, we include more than just crops. We include animals as well, to give ourselves a more broad understanding. Fishing and farming, to make it succinct and easy to remember. Fishing and farming. Well, we hardly have to go anywhere in the Bible, and we can find these things popping up all the time. Israel of the Old Testament was known as a nation of farmers. And we'll include under that things like shepherds and so forth. Dealing with animals or dealing with growing crops. Now, probably more of them dealt with animals than with the crops because it paid more. You would just raise crops for yourself, basically. You'd raise your melons, your wheat, your barley. You'd make your bread from that, your own onions and things like that. You would just raise all of that for yourself. And then you'd have to have big enough pasture to feed your cattle, to feed your sheep, to feed your oxen. And of course, springtime would come and you'd have a few births here and there. Those would be fattened up into the fall and then sold in town. Now, obviously, there are going to be people in town who don't live out there who need your cow, your lamb, your sheep, your goat, or whatever. Milk was another thing from both cattle and from goats to consider. The milking of cows and goats, some of it, most of it, obviously, for private personal use, and some of it to sell in the city. In other words, my point is, since you don't have need, since you are self-sufficient, you don't have need of any money, basically. You just don't have need of any money, except to pay a few taxes or whatever. You're self-sufficient. You make everything yourself. You grow everything yourself. Therefore, why do you have the need of so-called being, in an occupation where you make a living that gives you money to pay for something? We live in a different society. We make money because we have to pay for all these other services. Our home being built, or someone owns our home, the electric bill, all these bills. You don't have those bills. You're self-sufficient. You don't really have any need of money. You could just take someone now. You want to go live out in the wild somewhere. Maybe about all you'd have to come up with would be some taxes for your property there. You wouldn't have to have any income tax. You don't have any income. You just have to find enough ways to make a little bit of money to pay your taxes on the property that you own. And make sure you build a building that whenever the assessor comes along, he thinks, a cow would live in that thing. So he assesses it zero, zero taxes on that. Pay a little tax on your property then. That's all. But that means you've got to be able to make everything yourself. Can't buy radios now. You can't make your own radio. You can't make your own radio. Now, if you had all the parts, maybe you could, but who made the parts, though? You can't make your own radio. You can't make your own batteries. You can't make any of those things. You just don't have the ability to make that. That goes back into industry, you see, to be able to produce things like that. But in the olden days, you don't need any things like that. You don't need to make a toilet. The Lord's Outdoors is your toilet there. Making a toilet, especially these fancy ones that they make today, you're not going to be able to make that yourself. It'd be impossible. But why the need? You have to keep that in mind as we're looking at these people and occupations in. The occupation people were in was farming. And they didn't farm to raise crops and to raise animals just to sell to other people to make money. They didn't have any need of money. You just lived on your own there. Obviously, your herd increases so much, you're going to sell sooner or later. You get an overproduction from your vegetable garden, and it won't keep indefinitely without refrigeration. And so you got to get rid of some of that. And so, well, obviously, you go into town or whatever, and you sell it. More often than selling it, barter was involved. You didn't need any money. You needed another object that someone else had, like that nice, sturdy chair to sit over in the corner of your dusty living room so you could sit on whenever you wanted to sit down. And you don't have time to make it. You're busy milking cows all day long. And so you trade a little newborn cow for maybe that chair over there. It was a barter economy, a barter society. The principle of trade was involved. But as I say, most of the people are making the things on their own. And then, of course, the other area would be fishing. But that would not be as nearly as important as farming. You'd have to live where you could fish. And all over Palestine you could farm. You'd have to live on the Sea of Galilee. You'd have to live on the Jordan River. You'd have to live on the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, some of the apostles did. Peter, James, and John, we know, were fishermen. Some of that probably was done for income's sake, because they had more involved than just one little family here. They had a little small business there with Patriarch Zebedee in charge. And so he's got his sons there. And remember, according to Matthew 4, he has some hired servants even working for him. Now, over in Matthew chapter 20, I think we'll take a look at this. Matthew chapter 20. This is an interesting parable. Again, it has spiritual, theological meanings to it, but we can read into it some history in the first century as well. I'm trying to, if you can determine, I'm trying to strike a balance here in your understanding. So I don't go too far in saying one thing or the other. But strike a balance in your understanding of the fact that although most people did things on their own and alone, there were exceptions to that. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 1. The kingdom of heaven is likened to a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. Okay, here we've got field hand, hired hands to work in the field. Maybe you have such a big vineyard that you either cannot do it yourself or you don't have enough children or grandchildren who can do it for you, or at least help you do it. So you go out and hire. Now that's going to cost you money, which means whenever you get your produce in, you've got to sell that to make money, or you'd never have any money to pay your employees. But when he had agreed with the laborers, they're laborers, slave laborers, not really slaves, of course, they're field hands. When he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. That was the place of concourse then. Just standing around, nothing to do. And, well, as we'll read on here, someone will say that no one had hired them. He said, "Go unto the vineyard, whatsoever is right I'll give you." He went out the 6th and the 9th hour and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out. Oh, here it is. He asked the question, "Why stand ye here all day idle?" And look what they say. They say unto him, "Because no man hath hired us." So we've got an interesting group of people here. We've got people evidently who are not landowners. They're not working on their own land. You can just hypothesize all different types of cases here. Maybe a 18-year-old whose mother and father is dead, and so you don't have any property. Maybe a bachelor who doesn't have any property. His father never had any to give him. Or maybe just the common lazy people of that day. You didn't want to work. You just didn't want to do anything. So you went around gabbing at the marketplace. And if someone came along and offered you some money to go work in their field, you'd go. Some people do that. They hang around the pool room during the day until someone comes in and says, "Anybody here want to go work a little bit today?" And they'll go work a little bit to make some money to play some more pool, of course. So when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, "Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first." And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received, so forth. Anyway, that's pretty much the end of the story, for our point of view. It's interesting, furthermore, that Paul talks in his epistles not about employees, but about slaves. When he talks about working conditions, it's never employer-employee. Now, we have to apply it as such today, but it's never employer-employee. It's always master and slave. Now, my point in saying that is, if there were a lot of jobs and a lot of employees, why wouldn't Paul just deal with it like that? Employer-employee. Slavery is a particular type of employment, you see. It is forced, compelled employment. It's a particular type. That must have meant there were not a lot of employers or employees back in those days. Ephesians chapter 6 speaks of this. Colossians chapter 4 speaks of this. Paul talks about slaves and masters and not employees and employers. Now that to me, you see, gives me a little hint of what it was like then. Today we wouldn't talk about slaves, we'd talk about employees. Obey those who have employed you. But they must not have had a lot of them, or Paul would have addressed that as such. And of course that's true because they didn't have factories and industries. Without factories and industries, you had no employers. Without employers, you had no employees. Most people are working on their own. Now that's kind of like a status symbol today to be self-employed, because most people aren't. Look at the people out there. What's the percentage of self-employed people? Well, it's just minuscule. When you've got, one Ford plant that you've got 4,000 people that work in there or something, self-employed, very few people self-employed. It's kind of a status symbol today. Back in those days, it wasn't a status symbol. That was just a thing. That was just what you were stuck with, whether you wanted it or not. You basically were self-employed. If you had a home and you had some property, why strike off and try to make it rich in Rome or Spain or Carthage or Antioch? Why not just stay there and do what everyone else did? Raise your sheep and your cattle, your oxen, and grow a few vegetables on the side as well. So I think that should cover that aspect of it well enough. I'm going to mention one other little small area before we conclude tonight. If you have any questions on that I haven't dealt with before we go on, if you want a better understanding of something, if I can even answer it right now. We have a fairly good picture, a fairly good understanding of what that was like then. Well, we really shouldn't because we haven't studied it deeply enough. So if you're saying, no, I don't have a good enough understanding, you're right in tune then. We'll have to study that a little more later on. Okay, that brings us to finance then. And then that will wrap up our look economically at this subject, finance. Someone had questioned about bankers. Let me see if I can find the passage. That's Matthew 25:27. We mentioned this, and we didn't turn to it. We mentioned this in an earlier study on tax collectors and the money changers. I said we wouldn't look at it then because we'll look at it in another class. And that's what we will do. We'll just mention the verse again now because this is the second time we've mentioned it. Matthew 25 and verse 27. The King James, as you could probably already discern, erroneously has exchangers. So that would take us back to money changers, money exchangers. But it's a different term than what we find over there in John chapter 2 of the money changers. And it's a term that just refers to bankers in general. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the bankers, and then at my coming I should have received my own with interest, with usury. So yes, there were such things as bankers, such things as loan officers, such things as loans, such things as credit, such things as savings accounts, such things as interest. All that has to be here or you couldn't have bankers and interest. How are the bankers going to have enough money to pay interest on the money that you leave on deposit? Unless they loan out some money and charge a higher rate of interest on that than they're paying you. You see, in order to be able to have something to line their own pockets with. So it just makes a lot of sense. All you have to do is read the verse and read into it the things that appropriately fit here. So yes, they had bankers, but again, like we've just discussed with the working world and the agrarian society, it wasn't a big occupation, and we're talking about Palestine. We're not talking about Rome. It'd be a much bigger occupation in Rome with all of these rich senatorial elite individuals there than it would be back in Palestine. But yes, there were bankers and there were financial monetary matters here in this area, but very little of it involved in Palestine. He's just using it as a parable, as part of the parable here anyway. There was very little of it because, as I've said before, of the very little need for money. Coins were being minted by this time, and it just started not too many centuries prior to this. Prior to that time, it was a weight of money involved, not a coin. Now, I know that coins today have a certain weight, but we don't go by their weight. We go by the fact that they're a coin. A nickel's a nickel. I don't know how much a nickel weighs. I'm not really concerned about the weight. I'm concerned about the coin itself. In pre-coining days, you weren't concerned about the shape or the size. You were concerned about the weight. How much tin is this? How much copper is this? Let's put it on a balance here. Let's weigh this and see how much this weighs. How much gold? How much silver? Does it weigh now? We're not concerned about the coin. Well, with those precious metals, even today, we're concerned in ounces. We're concerned about the weight and not so much the coin. The Roman coin was the denarius, which was quickly becoming the most popular current coin. And the one it was phasing out was the Greek drachma. The denarius is generally translated in the New Testament KJV as penny or shilling. Sometimes you'll find over in a marginal reference there. And I think, I don't know if it's in our Bible here, or you'll just generally read it in some older works. They say that a denarius is worth about 17 cents. Well, of course, that's way off the picture, as we discussed in the theory of translation before, because 17 cents is so relative. It's only relative to the day in which that man determined it was worth 17 cents, and it may not be worth that today. But I guess I don't have big problems with that. At least you know that a denarius is not $1 million. At least it gives you some approximation of how much that it was. 17 cents, maybe that's $3.50 today. Well, at least it lets you know it's not $3.5 million or $3,500, though. It's somewhere in the dollars or cents realm. So for what it's worth, I pass it along, although it's antiquated and I really don't use it anymore. The denarius was worth 17 cents. I better look that up. They may even have that in... It's the thing found over here in... No, they give us shillings and pence and half pennies, British coining over here in Matthew 20 and verse 2. There they translate it as a penny. And the coins frequently had the image, evidently, of the current Caesar on them. Matthew 22, verses 20 through 21. They frequently had the image of the current Caesar on them. And that evidently was one of the problems of the people not wanting, the certain sect in Israel, certain segment of the population not desiring to pay their taxes. I think I mentioned when we studied taxation that that's a debated question whether or not the coins of this particular era of Jesus' day, of the late 3rd decade of the 1st century A.D., actually had the picture of Caesar on them. But that seems to be the implication of the passage. I'm reading in Matthew 22 and verse 20. He saith unto them, whose is this image and superscription or inscription? It's almost like he's implying there are two different things there. One is an image or picture. The other is an inscription, which means a writing there involved. They saith unto him, Caesar's. That's both Caesar's image and his inscription. And so he says unto them, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So if we're going to take verse 20 of Matthew 22 at face value, as well as the people's answer in the succeeding verse, then I would say that the coins then had an image of the current Caesar on them. Okay, again, I apologize. Maybe I'm doing it too much, but I can tell when there's so much more to say that I wished I could say, so I apologize for not covering all of it like it could and should be covered, but that's only because I've got it done for another class. We're just giving you a brief look at this right now. We'll go into a lot more detail. We'll go into all the coins of Scripture you see, every single one of them, from the Old Testament all the way through the New, and the history of coinage and so forth in the Bible. And that's the whole study, so we can't be doing that as we're interrupting this study right now. So if you have questions, probably they'll be dealt with in that other class then.
Jesus.